Thank you very much, Horacio. Next up is Selin Islekel. She's an assistant professor of philosophy and affiliated faculty member of race and ethnic studies at Texas A&M University over nearby in College Station. Her work in 20th century continental philosophy, post-Foucauldian biopolitics, and decolonial feminisms extend to a critique of the politics of death, especially in relation to collective memory and epistemic responses to contexts of the overwhelming presence of death. She is the author of Nightmare Remains, The Politics of Mourning and Epistemologies of Disappearance, which investigates epistemic resistances engaged to the collective acts of mourning in Turkey and Latin America. She is currently working on her second book, Monstrous Visions, Mechanisms of Defense and Regimes of Visibility, a decolonial genealogy of monstrosity, which analyzes how the notion of danger renders racialized modes of death invisible. She is co-editor of Foucault, Derrida, and the Politics of Punishment. Her articles in English and Turkish appear in journals such as Foucault Studies, Philosophy Compass, Theory and Event, Hypatia, CLR James Journal, Philosophia, Philosophy Today, and anthologies such as Turkey's Necropolitical Laboratory and Writing Sex, or let's see if I get it right, Cinsiyeti Yazmak. So let us extend our welcome as she delivers her paper, Decolonizing Damiens, the Coloniality of Sovereignty and Government of Terror.
Thank you so much. Just checking the sound. How is it like this? People hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Nikki, very much for this amazing organization and for bringing this conversation together. It's been such a rich day of thought, thinking, conversations, and I really look forward to more of it too. Thank you also. I'm aware that this is the last talk of the day. Thank you everyone for being here and engaging in conversation as well. Decolonizing Damiens is the name of this talk. Just as a heads up, at the beginning of the talk, I am referring to instances of physical violence. It is at the beginning of the talk, and we're moving on after that. But the very beginning is actually the one that is very familiar to most of us, which is that of Damiens. So, as we all know from the famous scene at the beginning of Discipline and Punish, it took a long time for Damiens to die. The tortures that he was subjected to were not unusual. His flesh was torn by red-hot pincers. One of his hands was burnt with sulfur, a mixture of molten lead, wax, sulfur, and burning resin was poured on the places that flesh was torn from. His body was quartered by 4 horses, and then it was burnt. The torture did not go over well. The pincers were twisted. The horses were untrained. They had to cut his body from his thighs because severing his arms and legs from the joints proved to be too difficult, and he still did not die after being quartered. It was 1757, and Damiens, the infamous regicide, did not die so easily. Death seems to take a long time when it is involved in spectacles to be watched. And so it happened in the spectacle of the death of the woman, the girl on the deck of Recovery, merely a few decades after the death of Damiens at 1791. As we learn from Saidiya Hartman, she was hoisted in the air over the deck of the ship, her limbs pulled and jerked, her legs and back whipped. First suspended by her wrists and then her legs, she was dropped repeatedly till her free fall. She did not budge after her free fall. The captain was annoyed, the observers were concerned. For the next 3 days after finding her way back down to the ship's hold, she did not move, nor did she eat until her body gave way to her death. The terrible spectacle, witnessed by everyone on the ship, paved way to her death, to be sure. Nevertheless, her death took longer than the spectacle, and it happened at another time. Death and spectacles, although seeming close to each other, do not always coincide, nor do they follow each other always in the same order. Hacı Lokman Birlik's spectacle, for example, took place after he was already dead. Birlik was killed by Turkish security forces in 2015. There are conflicting reports on the conditions of his death. According to autopsy results, he was shot 28 times. Some reports claim that he was shot while he was attacking the police forces, while others claim that he was executed while he was tending to his wounds. Unclear how exactly he died. What happened after his death, however, is quite well known. His dead body was mutilated, after which it was tied by the neck to the back of a security vehicle and dragged across the streets of Shirnak, a city in eastern Turkey. It was already a spectacle hard to miss for the residents who were curfewed and confined in their homes at the time. Nevertheless, the spectacle exceeded the confines of the city. The video of his body being dragged across the streets was released by the Turkish security forces and then released on Twitter and then re-released indefinitely, basically. His death became a spectacle after the fact, after he was long gone. So, as you may have gathered, this talk is a revisiting of the relation between spectacles and death. I start with these death events, though my goal in these terrible spectacles and revisiting these terrible spectacles is not to bring attention to the, of course, present humanity of these three figures, nor to condemn violence by appealing to its most visible and visceral formations. Rather, my goal here is to present a decolonial genealogy and revisit the relation between sovereignty and spectacles, and specifically question what coloniality does to this relation, or how it may shift the very core of sovereign logics of punishment. So I am returning to power in this talk. To this aim, the talk is divided into three sections. The first section focuses on Damian and the role of spectacles, and where I analyze Foucault's account on the disappearance of spectacles and the rise of modern political movements. In the second section, I focus on the girl on the deck of recovery that Hartman describes, and situate the spectacle of her death in relation to modernity and the emergence of a new mode of subjection at the colonization of the Americas and the transatlantic route. I argue that the coloniality of sovereignty consists in the opening of a new mode of living and dying, and the formation of a technology of power that may not let live, but may not let die either. Spectacles of corporeal punishment do not disappear, but proliferate in this context. So the last part of the talk focuses on Hacı Lokman Birlik's death and Turkey's current endlessly ongoing war on terror, and situate the modern and colonial nation state in relation to coloniality of sovereignty. Overall, I would argue that a decolonial genealogy demonstrates the emergence of a new relation between sovereignty and terror. In colonial sovereignty, terror is an inseparable element of sovereignty, formed not through the uniqueness, but rather the repetition and proliferation of spectacles of death. In this context, colonial and modern nation state functions as a government by terror, where spectacles of dead bodies outlive death. So that's the general roadmap. First section, the many faces of Damian. Foucault's discussion of Damian at the beginning of Discipline and Punish is famous not only for the gruesome details it accounts for, but also due to its place in Foucault's general architecture of power and its role with respect to the connection to sovereignty. As we all know, but this is going to be like a minor going back, repeating some parts of this, but as we all know, Discipline and Punish is a genealogy of power, from sovereignty, code from sovereignty to discipline, from spectacle to punishment, from the punishment of the body to the punishment of the soul, from Damian to the timetable, end quote. It's a key moment in the quote-unquote decline of the spectacle and the formation of modern rituals of execution, which later on, rather, in Foucault's account, rather focus on the punishment of the soul. In Foucault's account, modernity and modernization in the context of punishment involves disappearance of spectacles. And Damien's torture marks one of the last instances of this tight-knit relationship between sovereignty and spectacles. As a reminder, for Foucault, sovereignty is a specifically juridical mode of power, moving from the body of the sovereign to the body of a people that is an undifferentiated mass. It works through laws as prohibitions, and it is a necessarily territorial mode of power. As such, it denotes the capacity to set up laws over a given territory. The body of the people exists primarily as a mass that is important, not as a set of individuals, but as a whole that is subjected to laws that populates the territory. Because laws and borders are the key objects of sovereignty, each crime that disobeys laws or crosses borders is an attack against the sovereign. It attacks his rights, it attacks his rights and his will present in the law, and thereby attack his strength and physical body. This is from the Abnormal Lectures. The sovereign is vulnerable against the crime, Foucault argues, and quote, there was a fragment of regicide in each crime, and punishment is the sovereign's vendetta, end quote. Punishment is the way for the sovereign to erase and overcome the attack, undo the crime, and restore its power, a ritual reversal, where the task is to re-establish the disequilibrium between the criminal and the sovereign. Foucault says, in this context, quote, the ceremony of punishment then is an exercise of terror, end quote. And I want to highlight both the ceremony and the terror in this. As such, it is a political ritual that justifies the work of sovereignty, and quote, its ruthlessness, its spectacle, its physical violence, its meticulous ceremonial, its entire apparatus were inscribed in the political functioning of the penal system. Even though Damien was actually a regicide, this conception of each crime as a sort of regicide is what allows Foucault to focus on Damien's torture, not as a distinct or exceptional form of punishment reserved for serious crimes, but rather as an example for the general attitude of sovereignty towards punishment. Sovereignty deploys supplice as a method of obtaining truth, and this method is necessarily spectacular. Quote, torture is a technique. It is not an extreme expression of lawless rage, end quote. And the public becomes the witness of the reconstitution of sovereign authority in the spectacle. The sovereign becomes brand new through this. Hence, as Foucault says, again, quote, if torture was so strongly embedded in legal practice, it was because it revealed truth and showed the operation of power, end quote. Foucault's account of sovereignty and its juridical foundations follows from the accounts given in the classical theorists of sovereignty, and we can trace a history of classical theory of sovereignty from Baudin to Hobbes to Schmidt, and Foucault is very much situated in this, especially in the lecture courses 73 to 78, I would say. What is specific in Foucault's characterization, however, is not only on its focus on the law and the juridical nature of sovereign power, but its hold on the body, and thus its intensification as a corporeal mode of power, and the need for spectacularity for this hold on the body. Verena Erland-Busch explains that this link between sovereignty and spectacular corporeal punishment is all too often and all too easily seen as an effect of the relation between sovereignty and terror in general. So, all too expected similarity between supplice as seen in Damien's case, or the Reign of Terror and the French Revolution, for example, or the modes of spectacular and corporeal punishment seen across the globe. In this line, for example, Judith Butler reads into petty sovereignty as a kind of aspect of sovereignty that is attached to corporeal violence, and it does not need the institutions for it to be repeated. It can be deinstitutionalized and still replicating physical violence. In this line of thought, one can see all acts of corporeal and spectacular punishment, be in the form of supplice, the guillotine, death on the deck of a ship, or dragged on the back of a security vehicle, as all marked by this close tie of sovereignty and terror. Nevertheless, ostensibly similar events of violence do not necessarily serve the same function. As Foucault notes in the Punitive Society lectures, there are many ways of dying. Seemingly similar moments of spectacle and death, such as the supplice endured by Damian, or the torture deployed on the woman on the deck of Recovery, or the torture inflicted on the dead body of Hacı Lokman Birlik, can, even though they seem similar to each other, can and should be considered as distinct from each other. Between these three instances of what seems like sovereign violence, not only the subject of torture is different, but the temporality of death, the function of the spectacle, as well as what and who is meant by the subject and by the sovereign shift significantly. So, between these instances, it is important to analyze what happens to and changes in sovereignty, and specifically, as I will focus on the second section, the irreducible shift of coloniality that marks this shift. So, section 2, coloniality and redistribution of spectacles. Achille Mbembe writes, quote, "I start from the idea that modernity was at the origin of multiple concepts of sovereignty." This is from Necropolitics. Indeed, while Foucault's sovereignty has a particular focus on tying sovereign authority to monarchic and feudal authority, especially within the European context, this account on the relation between sovereignty and terror takes on a different phase when one considers the multiplication and dispersion of spectacles of subjection, particularly in relation to the emergence of modernity. While Damian is punished by sovereign authority, neither the spectacle of the death of the woman on the deck of Recovery, nor the dead body of Hacı Lokman Birlik take place in relation to formations of classical sovereignty by any means. Nevertheless, these take place as modern spectacles, spectacles of death that are situated at that linkage between modernity, the emergence of man, maybe, and terror. The question is, where do we situate modernity in punishment? And what are the ways in which modernity ruptures, shifts, and even intensifies the connection between sovereignty and terror? So we've been talking about modernity. In this one, I'm focusing specifically on punishment aspect, and in the political Foucault, where are we getting to modernity aspect? So Foucault's account on modernity and punishment focuses on the development of a shame or an embarrassment in modernity regarding corporeal punishment. Accordingly, this is precisely what starts shifting with the intensification of disciplinary mechanisms, where the spectacle of public torture starts disappearing. Power starts developing mechanisms that target the soul as much as the body, thus focusing rather on methods such as surveillance and regulation rather than supplice. Hence, very famously, Foucault says, the gloomy festival of punishment started dying out slowly 18th century onwards, leaving its place to the intensification of more and more invisible modes of punishment that were, if not any less violent, less proud of this violence. Accordingly, modern justice no longer takes responsibility for the violence that is bound up with its practice. If it too strikes, if it too kills, it is not as a glorification of its strength, but as an element of itself that it is obliged to tolerate, that it finds difficult to account for. In modern justice, there's a shame in punishing. And what is modern is particularly this shame, according to Foucault. Nevertheless, modernity has more than one starting point. Foucault, also talking about supplice, says that it is true that the practice of torture goes back at least as far as the Inquisition, of course, and probably to the torture of slaves, end quote. And it is not coincidental that the places that he is going back to is the Inquisition and the torture of the enslaved. According to Aníbal Quijano, modernity must be understood in relationship to the opening of a new mode of power in the process of colonization of the Americas and the start of the Atlantic route. The coloniality of power, accordingly, is the first identity of modernity. And it is defined by two key historical processes. Quote, one was the codification of differences between conquerors and conquered in the idea of race as a supposedly different biological structure that placed some in a natural situation of inferiority to others. And the second one is the constitution of a new structure of labor and control of its resources and products. What follows from these is the emergence of a new world order, in Sylvia Wynter's terms, while the idea of race emerges for the first time as a way of granting legitimacy to relations of domination imposed by the conquest. Slavery as a mode of racialized subjection emerges in this context. I want to dwell on this moment of the emergence of a new mode of subjectivity and subjection and in relation to this. The formation of racialized slavery as the underlying condition of modernity marks the emergence of this subjectivity and a new relation between power and death. Edward Glissant talks about this in terms of the emergence, opening up of the abyss, which swallows in many ways the globe with it. First, the abyss of the slave ship, quote, the belly of the boat that dissolves you, precipitates you into an onward from which you cry out. The boat is, quote, pregnant with many dead as living under the sentence of death, end quote, Glissant says. It marks a moment where the dead and the living are not separated from each other with clear lines. The sentence of death, however, is not the same sentence of supplice. It is neither decreed nor ceremonial. It is utterly mundane. The abyss, the abyss also for Glissant serves as the elysium for the new emergence of new modes of living and dying and new relations between subjects and terror and this new world order. Specifically, it founds the formation of a new kind of death, and a kind of death that Bembe says, that is death in life, where quote, the enslaved is kept alive, but in a constant state of injury, in a phantom-like world of horrors and intense cruelty and profanity. Long day. In this world, corporeal violence that resembles supplice in forms becomes not an extremity nor any singular show of power, but rather becomes an element in manners, an act of pure destruction aimed at instilling terror. Terror in colonial power is not a ceremony, it's a mode of caprice. It's an everyday and not unique appearance, ceases to be punitive, and not a matter of vendetta. In this sense, the new mode of subjection that emerges in the Atlantic route consists of a phantom-like world where violence and spectacle consist regular occurrences of this world, demonstrating the emergence of a new kind of power that uses spectacular corporeal punishment, not in irregular cases, but as a form of its sustained exercise. Moreover, this repetition of spectacles is not, again, it's not punitive and it's not an act of punishment. And it is not connected to the emergence of formation of a ritual of truth. Rather, Saadia Hartman says, it is yoked to enjoyment. So what seems to mark the colonization of the Americas or the Atlantic route? If we shift the modernity or the space of modernity to Quijano's periodization, is the opening of this phantom-like world as a technology of power. Whilst Foucault's account of sovereignty consists in the power to make die, the coloniality of power consists in opening up of this world, where one may not be let live, but not let die either. This is what I will call here the coloniality of sovereignty, and a shift in the formations of sovereign authority that works neither through laws or borders, but rather specifically through the opening of that spaceless abyss and through the constant repetition of spectacles. In this, what is new about modernity also becomes clear. Neither torture nor spectacles of corporeal pain disappear, but they rather become routine, dispersed, and racialized through and through. So, it is important to note that according to Keanu and according to much of decolonial thought, coloniality is to be distinguished from the historical moment of colonialism. The process of colonization marked the opening of a new configuration that, as Keanu says, has proven to be more durable and stable than colonialism in whose matrix it was established. Coloniality extends beyond the temporal framework of colonization. In this sense, while the formal processes of colonization of the Americas and the Atlantic circuit mark concrete historical moments, they also constitute shifts into new modes of subjection. At the same time, inasmuch as coloniality is a global phenomenon, it does not function in the same way across the globe. We already referred to the boomerang thesis of Foucault. And as Foucault says, society must be defended, and I will read the same quote here. It should never be forgotten that while colonization, with its techniques and its political and juridical weapons, obviously transported European models to other continents, it also had a considerable boomerang effect on the mechanisms of power in the West and on the apparatuses, institutions, and techniques of power. A whole series of colonial models was brought back to the West. Achille Mbembe refers to the solar and nocturnal sides of modernity, where similar technologies of power deploy different techniques and effectuate different results across the globe. In other words, the boomerang effect of power relations that make its way to Europe in the aftermath of colonization, in this sense, also return to different geographies and exceed the Atlantic circuit in producing new and maybe monstrous technologies of power. So in this sense, while we are talking about boomerang effect as a return back to Europe, there's a kind of Mbembe's emphasis is that there's also that boomerang doesn't stop. There's also a return back to other parts of the globe with those technologies too. So it is not just as like it went and came back. Coloniality in the context of modern nation state is one such aspect, and it creates a kind of house of horrors where things that appear similar to each other and familiar can nevertheless become marked by abyssal difference. One can talk about coloniality and sovereignty as a colonial modern mode of power, for example, but diagnosing it as such does not mean that it is going to operate through the same techniques across geographies. And instead, it may function differentially, deploying different goals, modes of institutionalization, and modes of organization. This has crucial implications for modes of living and dying that emerge in the colonial development. For in Foucault's account, the development of modern and the individual also implies the infiltration and permeation of sovereign authority with technologies of governmentality that are concerned with the general category of well-being. He goes into this at various points, not all the way into omniscient subject and power in 1981. He constantly refers to the idea of well-being as a key part of the integration. Hence, the de-emphasis of the corporeal and spectacular violence attached to the sovereign authority is accompanied by increasing mechanisms that are concerned with regulation and management of life and living, well-being, and health. The nocturnal body of modern terror, on the other hand, demonstrates another kind of deployment. Mbembe says, quote, the state's progressive loss of the monopoly of violence ended in a gradual devaluation of monopoly to a multiplicity of bodies operating either outside of the state or else within it, but in relative autonomy. This is a form of government by terror in which Bembe says at issue is no longer so much to repress or to discipline or to promote the well-being of a part of the population, as it is to kill either en masse or in small doses. The multiplication of killing makes death the normal state of affairs, wherein government by terror consists in manufacturing an entire crowd of people who specifically live at the edge of life, or even its outer edge, people for whom living means continually standing up. So this is what Bembe calls necropolitics, which consists not in the killing itself, but rather the administration of death by creating that zone, and in doing so, managing and regulating entire populations by and through them. Colonial sovereignty gives birth to necropolitical state formation, which works through managing and administering that, and at maximizing. So this we can say, coming to the conclusion, we can say that the multiplication of spectacles of terror that opens up in the phantom world of modernity also brings with it another relationship of terror that is distributed geographically across the globe. It is specifically the government by terror that emerges in the process and which works through managing, administering, maximizing. The government by terror does not see that as connected to loss, and it rather results in general habituation. The generalized habituation to loss was also brought up. Within this context, there is nothing tragic about that, and it becomes increasingly spectral. In government by terror, death is utterly normal, away from tragedy, and the dead body is devoid of any meaning. This is the context in which the body of Foucault is dragged through the multiple streets at the back of a security vehicle, striking in its obstinacy and wanting to signify the death that fell, and nevertheless, it's so outliving that death. Government by terror, in conclusion, focuses on multiplying terror in order neither to reinstate authority in the face of a crime, nor as a side element to an economic motive of benefit, or as a side effect of the goal of well-being or health. Instead, it is formed in the normalization of terror in the form of opening up death worlds, where death and the dead become utterly meaningless and anything but tragic. This is the world of the necropolitical nation states, where acts are split from punishments, bodies split from rights, and spectacles are split. The coloniality of sovereignty is what ensures their togetherness and their separation at once. Thank you.